independent of the government, although governments have lots of propaganda, media machines. But the media has moved away from government into itself, and media has become indeed a government in itself. It has its own particular point of view, it has its own particular interest and ideology. It represents itself more than it represents the government. And one thing I have to say, for example, in the US where I live, believe me, Wall Street is more right-wing in Iran than George W. Bush was. In fact, it is the Wall Street that constructs a lot of what goes against Iran, than more in Wall Street than in the White House or in the State Department. The fact is that the media has taken over a lot of what happens to the public opinion, and the public is becoming increasingly more misinformed and so on. But just quickly, if I was to give you the example, I don't know whether I should, of the U.S.-Iran relations. Looking through this, I have been in this relationship for 25 years with Senator Johnston sitting there as my chair of the American-Iranian Council. We have tried our best to bring a better understanding of the two countries. U.S.-Iran relation is full of fact and fiction. There are really, both sides say facts about each other, and they also fictionize a lot of what really is there. Let me give you an example of the nuclear issue. Fact, Iran does have a nuclear program. Fact, Iran has concealed certain aspects of its nuclear program. Fact, Iran does, in fact, allow a lot of inspections, but Iran does not accept intrusive inspections. Fact, Iran has never, ever said that it has had a nuclear program, but except for the peaceful purpose. These are facts, they say, the Iranian side. Now, let me just, a few more important facts here. Iran doesn't have a bomb. Iran is not building a bomb. Iran doesn't even have the capability of building a bomb as we speak. Even IAEA doesn't say that Iran has the capability or it has diverted. Not even the US and its spy agencies, 16 of them, would tell you that Iran is building bomb or in the process of building bomb. They even say they haven't even made decision. The US government's position is that Iranian leaders have not yet made the decision in that direction. And yet, when you look at the Wall Street Journal, for example, or Washington Post or others, you get the impression that Iran really actually is building bomb. Here is the government who says none of that, but the fact is that in the media you read very much different. Now, are they completely wrong? Well, they have ideas. Yeah, well, why should Iran conceal its nuclear program? Why should Iran at all have a nuclear technology while it has this oil and gas so much? Iran lives in a neighborhood that is very dangerous, okay? And therefore, it must be thinking about something that it can protect itself. And so therefore, at the end, they come to the decision that perhaps Iran is at least, quote unquote, intending to build bomb. And this issue of intention is a major issue in US-Iran relations. I mean, I was just listening to Mr. Mehman Parast, our Iranian ambassador here, and I mean, that a spokesperson with the foreign ministry. He said Iran has the right for the nuclear technology. Yes, but Iran also has obligations. Rights come with obligations. I think they should be really balanced. What I'm trying to say is that both sides.
Вопрос только в одном, почему это обязательство есть.
The whole question is how come Iran does have these obligations and others don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different issue. We can discuss here and say Israel doesn't have, Israel also conceals, Israel also lies.
Да, но нет обязательств.
But
they don't have any obligations.
No, what I'm saying is that the fact that Israel doesn't do A, it doesn't make Iran right to do B. What I'm trying to say is that we just have to make sure that we say the truth. The fact is that not only the media or the government, the analysts, the people who are supposedly have to be neutral or independent, are not also getting into this in the right way.
Спасибо. Михаил Ильич,
Thank you.
то есть через вопрос. Ваш ответ через
And
вопрос.
your answer will be in one
нет
more
информации
question.
никакой,
So
есть
there is no
образы,
information,
есть
there are some
конструирование
stereotypes,
образов, есть война образов.
they are
А за
constructing these
информацией
stereotypes,
нас и
while
господин Бахар,
the information
и
Mr.
господин
Bahar
Galloway
and
отсылают
Mr.
в
Galloway,
интернет.
they're sending us
Якобы
to find
интернете вы
information in the
найдете
internet.
более
Like
объективную
if we try
информацию,
to
чем в
browse
этом
some
мире,
web pages,
где все
we can find
приступили к
something else.
конструированию
Like in this
разных
world when
образов мира.
everyone starts building different images of the world, pro-Iranian, anti-Iranian, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, pro-American, anti-American. I simply wanted to object. At some point of time, minutes ago, someone said that in order to change the policy of the government in London, you don't have to have the mass demonstrations with looting because you can simply go to elections. Here I'd like to say that people who stick to this point, I think they made this big show when they had the previous elections in Belarus and when they had the big elections in the Russian Duma. After the presidential elections, they wanted to present the situation like the miscount votes in Russia. But if we take a look at their election situation, they believe they correctly count all the votes, while the number of candidates or candidates is quite limited. There are two options: either the miscount votes or the count votes correctly, but you cannot vote for anyone you want. From the standpoint of the ordinary person, it's the same. They are unable to express their opinion. So basically, breaking shop windows and massive manifestations of protest in London. This is an effort to explain people that others might try to get to the Prime Minister's office. But if some group of people in the city, in the world, to enable them to come to power, they would create this system for their support. Not just in the newspapers, but also in the internet. So this support group would interpret any event in favor of those who basically create such a group, regardless of what is actually happening. So in this sense, the system of double standards is quite understandable. Everything that is happening to our benefit is good. Everything that is not happening to our benefit is bad, regardless of what happens in reality. Let's look in the eyes of the truth.
Господин Сальмау, прежде чем мы перейдем к
Mr.
выступлениям из зала,
Before we
вопрос,
switch
потому
to
что
the
очень
questions
хочется
from the audience,
знать
I'd
конкретную
like to ask you,
ситуацию.
I'd like you to know the real situation. As I know, Al-Ahram is one of the biggest Egyptian newspapers, and under Mubarak it wasn't an opposition newspaper.
Я прав?
Am I correct in saying this? Al-Ahram?
Under Mubarak, there was no official censorship. There were other means of controlling the press other than official censorship. Official censorship was abolished under Sadat. But it doesn't mean that the press was free, of course. There was a lot of manipulation with the press. Al-Ahram is the oldest newspaper in the area. It's more than 140 years old. It's older than many states in the Middle East. And it has managed to create a tradition, an institution, no matter how much it is being politicized at one era or another. But there is a journalistic institution there to reckon with. I agree, of course, with Mr. Galloway that the carpet is being drawn from under the press a great deal. I'm not sure that the press will disappear altogether, as he says. I hope not. But I think the press is passing through a period where it is readapting and is moving more from the news aspect of the press, which, as he rightly pointed out, is now taken over by the internet and television, into the analysis and the narrative article and what television and especially the internet cannot do. And I think the more the press moves into that new service, journalistic service, the more it ensures its future. But I'd like to go back to the very explosive example of the terrorist and the freedom fighter that you brought about, which is an excellent example of how two conflicting points of view can never come together and can never agree to one definition about somebody who is doing an act of violence. Is he a freedom fighter, as we have seen throughout history, or is he a terrorist? Of course, with the case of the Palestinians, the people that has been, expelled out of, they've witnessed an exodus second only to the Jewish exodus itself that we know in history. They've been, their land has been annexed and for 60 years. And every United Nations resolution has stood by the right, has even stood by the right of oppressed and occupied peoples to resort to armed struggle as a sign of resistance, as a means of liberation. And at the same time, the matter is still being discussed about whether freedom fighter or not freedom fighter. It is not the policy that you project. It is not the fact that people go out in Israel asking for peace. I think if the Israeli governments have been listening to its own people asking for peace, a lot of the problems in the Middle East would have been solved. But the other example which came up here is also the nuclear thing. And this is an excellent example of double standards, whereas both Israel and Iran are being accused of having a nuclear program. Indeed, with Israel, there's even assurances that it does have more than just a program. But yet, the concern is more with Iran and not with Israel. That they have tried, the West has tried, especially America, to sell this policy to us in the Middle East. But for us in the Middle East, the threat really comes from the nuclear program of Israel rather than Iran. This is not the way it appears in the Western press at all.
Now we're switching to the questions from the audience. I can see several hands here. I'd like to ask my question first. Mr. Tretyakov, the question is to you. You created this Независимая Gazeta, independent newspaper. This is a mass media outlet that published any opinions at all. So without any bias, basically that was the slogan of the journalism of this independent newspaper. But also in your editorial articles, you say that you do use double standards. So what are these double standards from the standpoint of the person who created an example, a model of independent press? Thank you very much. I've been listening to this discussion because I wrote the special textbook of journalism. I could say a lot of things. I just would like to mention that in general, the situation with freedom of media, freedom of expression, I mostly share the point of my Egyptian colleague. What he said, in my opinion, is much closer to the reality. I also would like to ask my question. But before this, the second thing I wanted to mention, in my opinion, right now, I'm not familiar with the Arab press. I'm mostly familiar with the Western press and Russian-speaking press. Of course, right now, the problem of objectivity, the problem of unbiased opinion, this is as relevant as the problem of the freedom of press. But the freedom of press, this goal is probably achieved with the arrival, with the advent of the internet. I guess the freedom is almost absolute. But the problem of objectivity and unbiased coverage, let me now ask my question. If, for instance, the Western media, in terms of objectivity, if it were as good as they tell us with the objectivity situation, I think all of the Western media would probably dismantle the respective departments of their secret services. How come they still have secret services if it's all good? But in the most democratic countries, they have the strongest secret agencies. Not in some dictatorship, but democratic countries. This is a paradox that politicians do not want to acknowledge, do not want to perceive the, how come you compare us with these? If you are so honest, why don't you tell us everything? Why do you need this giant number of agents? When you read the newspaper, what they write about Russia, so make a decision, because it's all the truth in that newspaper. Basically, Maxim, I didn't get your question about double standards. I didn't get this question either. That's why I'm asking you, because you are my teacher, my professor. But from the standpoint of double standards, you said that I use double standards. But once we talked together, you said that in the West they had double standards. The example of double standards have already been mentioned. Israel is eligible to have nuclear weapons. Iran is not eligible. As a representative of the country that does have nuclear weapons, no one is arguing against my right to have these weapons. Russia, or it's the legacy of the Soviet Union, as the citizen of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and now as a citizen of Russia, I'm more concerned about the nuclear weapons in the hands of Americans rather than Iraq's or Iranian. Although Russia and the United States, according to the international law, they are eligible to have nuclear weapons because they are subject to various obligations, liabilities, and safeguards. So, as a person with a common sense, in order to be objective, I don't really understand how come Iran is not eligible or not allowed to have nuclear weapons when others like Russia or the United States or France or the UK or Pakistan or India or Israel have it. How come Iran cannot have it? Are they the worst country in the world or what? By the way, this nation is far more ancient versus America, or even older than the Russia, but I can claim they're older than the American nation, and I'm saying this responsibly because they have the sense of historic responsibility, because they've always felt responsible since they exist as a nation. So basically, these are two bright examples of double standards. And the last thing I'd like to mention, the example of double standards, the examples of biased coverage or lack of objectivity. You probably know this story, the first Chechen war or the first Chechen campaign on Russia fought in Chechnya. Journalists can go from the objective position to the less objective position. Maxim Shevchenko probably remembers the situation because together we worked together in one newspaper when this first war in Chechnya started. It was back in 1994, the first Chechen campaign, and the free democratic, that's how the free and democratic mass media in Russia, in Moscow, they started writing about how nice were those Chechen fighters. They fought for their freedom, and how bad were the federal armed forces from Russia and their generals. I published the whole series of articles, which was called Democratic Slogans, the Loss of Our Own Government and the War. The defeat of our own government in the war. So basically, if you keep on fighting on the backs of your own soldiers in general, so that fight this war and the next war, they will leave the battlefield because of your spitting on their backs. And what will happen to you afterwards? What will happen to your democracy? So basically here objectivity becomes secondary, but because you, Maxim, said that right now the whole world is the global battlefield of information wars, so people who, they don't care about objectivity, especially the Western soldiers, because they're simply soldiers. Okay, thank you. I think you might give me enough time. No, I can give you more time because there are some others. I can give you 2 minutes. just would like to draw your attention to the role of social networks, social media. Well, then I give you 3 minutes, especially after the Arab events, 3 minutes. Speaking about the social networks, I'd like to say that Facebook, especially the page Syria revolution of the Syria versus regime, every Friday they organized various meetings. Voting starts on Tuesday. And the names of the slogans which will be used in all over the country. And also I'd like to say that you said it right. The mass media is a tool of war, but mass media cannot really win the war with the false information. The truth will always ultimately win. And right now the Arab-speaking channels, news channels, there is a great selection of those now. In 1 or 2 days' time, the person will stop watching this or that particular channel.